This is Tech for Humans. It's a Bible study from Good Shepherd about technology and the lives of faithful people, and what it means, and what stories we tell. So I'm so glad that you are here with us. I'm glad if you are back, if you've watched the first episode. If not, you can go back and watch it later. They're all here on our website where you can find them. There will be 5 of them by the time we are done. And so I kind of show you what that will look like here. Our first class, our first video, dealt with the idea of the message and the medium and the differences between those two things and how it relates to technology and how it relates to the scriptures and what it teaches about technology, because technology is in there. Today we're going to talk about social media and relationships and look at a biblical perspective on relationships, what they mean, and then talk for a minute about the technology of social media, what it allows, where the great benefits are, and where the challenges are too, because I think there's a lot of both when it comes to technology. So I want to start today by giving you an image, and some of you have perhaps heard this analogy before, and it comes to us from one of those classic American Silicon Valley inventors, creators, designers. This is from Steve Jobs, one of the founders of Apple Computer, and in which he talks about computers, and he uses the analogy of the bicycle for the mind. So I'm going to play a clip briefly so that you can hear from Mr. Jobs himself about what this means.
I think one of the things that really separates us from the high primates is that we're tool builders. And I read a study that measured the efficiency of locomotion for various species on the planet. The condor used the least energy to move a kilometer. And humans came in with a rather unimpressive showing about a third of the way down the list. It was not too proud of a showing for the crown of creation. So that didn't look so good, but then somebody at Scientific American had the insight to test the efficiency of locomotion for a man on a bicycle. And a man on a bicycle, or a human on a bicycle, blew the condor away, completely off the top of the charts. And that's what a computer is to me. What a computer is to me is it's the most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with. And it's the equivalent of a bicycle for our minds.
Bicycle for our minds. Steve Jobs there talks about technology in general and what it can do for us. He used the idea of locomotion, of moving, and the efficiency, the amount of energy that it takes. The bicycle is a neat example of this, because if you think about a bicycle, at least in the classic sense of the bicycle, so we're not talking about e-bikes, electronic bikes, it's only the human which is providing the power. So there's no motor on a traditional bicycle. There's nothing that adds in power except for the human. But the way that the bicycle is designed allows that human to move much more efficiently because of the wheels, because of the gears, and bikes have become much more sophisticated than the bicycle that I'm presenting in this slide, of course. So the bicycle takes human power and makes it more efficient. It does not replace it. It just helps it be more efficient. Jobs is saying that is what a computer is, that a computer, at least the way that he envisioned it many years ago, does not replace a human, but helps the human become more efficient. And you could say the same thing about a calculator, just in a much more limited sense. A calculator makes human thinking much more efficient by doing the computing, offloading that computing to the calculator instead of the human. This is a really good analogy, I think, and a helpful way when we think about technology in our lives, whether it is functioning like a bicycle for our mind or a bicycle for our lives. I guess the alternative would be more like an automobile. If you think about an automobile, the power is not coming from the person driving it. The power is coming from, gasoline or electricity or some other location. Not only does this make a car be able to be much faster than a bicycle ever could be, but it changes the human's relationship with the world around them. It allows them to go faster than they can kind of pay attention. It allows them to kind of drive over the landscape instead of through the landscape in many senses. It's not too different from, there's a lot of other analogies like this. There's an American writer, Wendell Berry, who talks about the difference between a path and a road. A path kind of follows the landscape, whereas a road cuts across a landscape and pays less attention to the relationship between the place that you are traveling through and yourself. So I like this analogy of the bicycle for the mind. It's similar to last week I talked about, to use the terms instruments and devices. In many ways, these ideas are connected, that an instrument enhances something that we do, whereas a device replaces something that we do. So you could think of it this way, a bicycle for the mind, or a bicycle is a tool that enhances our own power. It makes our power more efficient. It helps us be more human or more whatever we are doing. Whereas another type of technology could replace, could kind of drive right over what we are trying to do. I want to review the definition of technology that we used. It comes from an author named John Dyer. His book I've used a lot for this study to think about a Christian response to technology. And so his definition is that technology is the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. The bicycle is a great example. It is a human activity. Bicycles are for people, principally. They are a tool, and we transform creation, usually metal of some kind, to create them. And then it gives us a practical purpose. They also transform what we are able to do. It shortens the time that it takes us to get from one place to another and so forth. So a bicycle would be a great example of technology. But then so would so many other things that come into our daily life. There's two reasons why I was thinking of Steve Jobs today as I prepared for this study. One was this idea of the bicycle of the mind, which I'm very grateful for. The other is something that maybe some people know about Steve Jobs and maybe some people don't. Something that he shared in common with Bill Gates, who was kind of his rival for a time, that both of them were known to be quite protective of their children when it came to technology, that they were restrictive, that they were skeptical of just how much access their own kids would have to computers, which is very interesting. They weren't against it, obviously, in their inventions, but they weren't fully ready to just let their own children just go wild on the technology either. So that's interesting. A lot of people may not know that. Thinking about that today has come across some research for us to think about in our use of technology, especially electronic technology. I want to share some research that was done a while ago. I assume it would only be more true now. And so this is information about what the question was, which of the following do you do on a device in the morning? And the people surveyed for this were parents of children. This particular study comes from a book that Andy Crouch did about technology in the family, and so it was particularly parents that were asked. So these are adult parents of children aged 4 to 17. What do you do on the device first thing in the morning? And so here are their answers. 74% of them said that they check email. 51% said that they send or read text messaging, back and forth between people they know. 48% said they check social media. So almost half of parents said they checked into social media in the morning on their device. And then smaller percents, 36% read the news, 24% worked on their calendar, 17%, at least it's on here, used a Bible or a devotional app. We'll be generous and say it's because that's, of course, the other 83% were using a paper Bible. We'll just pretend that's true. Then there was some other things, watching video. I noticed the games weren't on here, and I'd be interested to know now, especially how many parents maybe use a device to play a game in the morning. I don't know. But the top three, 74%, 51%, 48%, all about half or more, did things that were very social in nature. Checking email, responding to text, checking social media are all social network things that we do in our lives using devices to communicate back and forth. So both directions. We can send and receive using text, using social media, using email. And so the majority of adults were doing this, using their devices to do this every morning. If we looked at information about teenagers, a younger generation, those statistics would be much higher, although they would fall in some different categories. So here's some research from the Pew Foundation. The vast majority of teens have access to digital devices such as smartphones at 95%. So if you're in that 5% of teens that have somehow been denied access to a smartphone in our country, I guess your parents are hearing you now. 95%. All the other kids have one. Desktop or laptop computers, that was 90%. Gaming consoles at 80%. And the study shows there's been an uptake in daily teen internet users from 92% in that 2014 to 2015 study to 97% today. This study came out last year, so it's pretty current. 97% of teens were daily internet users. So basically all teens in our country are online every day for the most part. And this is interesting too. In addition, the share of teens who say they are online almost constantly has roughly doubled since that last study in 2014-2015. It was 46% then. It's 46% now from 24% then. So almost half of teens say now they are online almost constantly. What a change in numbers from not that long ago. We start thinking about social media and our relationships and our connectedness. Look how much of that connectedness happens on a device using technology that wasn't even around 20 years ago, and today is 97% of teens are using the internet to be connected every single day. Now, there could be some really good things. I'm sure there are some really good things that come out of this, and most teens would tell you that in some way. But there's a darker side to this as well. And in the same time period, there's been vast changes in not just among teens, but among adults in the last few decades in our country. There's even a new term that has come up, which if you haven't heard it before, they're called deaths of despair. Kind of a new term that came up. There was a Princeton University economist, a couple of them, who were doing work, and they noticed something. That in the 1900s, people's lifespans were getting longer. They were advances in health, there were advances in child mortality rates and things like this. So that people were living longer. To the average became about 80. But then at about the end of that 19th century, or 20th century, going into to this now 21st century, there was a segment of the population that changed, and that changed direction. So you can see since the 1990s, mortality has risen sharply among middle-aged, non-Hispanic white people, especially those without a college degree. And the reason, to a large extent, was because that class of people, white working class people, ages 45 to 54, were drinking themselves to death with alcohol, accidentally overdosing on opioids and other drugs, and killing themselves, often by shooting or hanging. Vanishing jobs, disintegrating families, and other social stressors had unleashed a rising tide of fatal despair. Let's switch so I can see the whole thing there. So that's what their study concluded. So that there was at least one group of people whose average age started to go in the wrong direction, decreased. And the causes that they stipulated and they showed in their research were largely social ideas. It wasn't because healthcare got worse. It was blamed on vanishing jobs, the changes in family, and other social stressors that caused people to die unnatural deaths, either because of overdoses or because of suicides. So things are going on socially at the same time period that social networking and online communication has really flourished. You also see this disintegration, at least in a number of categories of people who are living in despair over this. So something is going on here, and something is not right. And you can give a word for it. In fact, other studies have given the word loneliness to this problem. So one study said, can loneliness kill? A new study from Brigham Young University says yes. In fact, researchers say loneliness is now a major public health issue and represents a greater health risk than obesity and is as destructive to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The study published in the journal Perspective on Psychological Science was a meta-analysis, so it's looking at a bunch of other studies covering 3 million people. And so what it found was that social isolation, loneliness, and living alone can increase mortality risk 29%, 26%, and 32% respectively, after adjusting for all the statistical things. So just those things alone can be isolated as raising the mortality rate, making it much more likely that you will die earlier if you are socially isolated, if you have feelings of loneliness or living alone. Now, that doesn't mean that it necessarily will do those things, and I think we'll see there are ways that people deal with these issues. But when you isolate for those things, it has an effect similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, greater than the health risk of obesity. So what does this tell us? It tells us something that most people won't, which is that we, as a culture, are very lonely. Loneliness is a hard thing to admit to, especially as we'll see later. We are so social in our creation, down to our existence as people of God. We're so tied to one another that to admit to loneliness, admit to feeling alone, may be one of the hardest things for anyone to ever admit because of how painful it is for humans. So loneliness is an issue, and it's a hard issue because we don't like to talk about it, is how painful it is. So we're going to talk about relationships, what it means, where they come from. I want to go back to Genesis again, the first book of the Bible, because it teaches us so much about our creation, about our purpose. And we hear in the second chapter, after God has created Adam, the human made of the earth, God says it is not good that the Adam, the human, should be alone. It is not good for humanity to be alone, for anyone to be alone. So, of course, Then God creates the woman to be with the man, and there is suddenly community. This is God's intention, according to the Bible, is that humans are together and not alone, that there is a connectedness. We see this in many places. We see it in God, in God's self as the Trinity. God is made in relationships, Father, Son, and Spirit. Humans are created in relationship with one another. It goes to the very core of who we are. In fact, it cannot be separated from who we are. We do not exist apart from our relationships. You can see this in a distinction between two terms that Andrew Root, who's a writer that often writes about ministry, uses: the difference between individuals and persons. And these words might sound like basically synonyms, right? They're both describing people, individuals versus persons. But there's a difference in what they imply. An individual can be broken up into just one person. They can be, I shouldn't use the word person there, I guess. An individual can be separated to one creature, one entity, who could be analyzed apart from all relationships. A person cannot be separated from their relationships. A person is connected to those around them necessarily, and that's part of a person's identity, is their relationships. So an individual has relationships, like the way a car has cup holders, right? But a person doesn't just have relationships. A person is made up of relationships. A person is relationships and would not be that person without those relationships. The Bible gives us a view of humanity in which we are persons. We are not just individuals. We cannot be completely subdivided from our neighbors. We wouldn't make sense. We wouldn't survive. We wouldn't be who we are or who we are called to be. God sees us as persons, people embedded in communities, relationships, some good, some bad, but always we are affected by those to whom we are connected. We are persons, not just individuals. It'd be interesting to think about technology, and this may be one of the questions that I'll ask you to think about, is in what way does technology treat people as individuals, and in what way does technology treat people as persons? There's a back and forth here. In fact, one of my all-time favorite quotes, it comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was writing in the book Life Together. He said, "Whoever cannot be alone should beware of community. But then on the other hand, whoever cannot stand being in community should beware of being alone." There's this idea that who we are within ourselves alone determines how we enter into community and who we are in community. But by the same hand, who we are in community and how we relate to others affects how we are alone. Our independence depends on our interdependence, and vice versa. We cannot be just in community, and we cannot be just alone. We must be both of these things. This is why in Scripture you'll find all kinds of examples of people alone and how they may separate from a time. Even Jesus separated for a time from the crowds in order to pray. But he always comes back, right? He does not decide to live a life as a hermit somewhere. He always returns to the people because we are always both. So with those things in mind, let's look for a bit at this idea of social media, technology that connects us to one another. Let's start with the promise the story of technology. I said last time, technology always has three stories. What the story that we can do to creation with the technology, that's one story. Another story is what the technology will do to us, transform us in return. And then the third story is what it means and what it tells us about life. So what's the story with social media? What is the promise? And on the not so good part of that, what is the superpower that it may tempt us with? I think the promise of social media is it can supercharge those connections, the relationships that we can have a greater influence, greater reach, that we can know more people, that we can know about what's going on in the lives of our friends. These are good things, right? That we can see pictures of children that were born on the other side of the country that maybe we wouldn't have seen until much later had we not had social media. That we can check in with our friends. It makes it much easier to do those things. That is the promise of social media. And I know I know sometimes for me and for many of you, it does actually work this way, which is wonderful. There's a superpower, though, that I think social media also tempts us with, which is that we can know more and more of our neighbors without actually having to talk with them, converse with them, that we can somehow pull out more from relationships than we have to put in of ourselves, or that we can only put in what we choose and get out what we choose. Unlike a regular relationship where you kind of have to give your whole self and you kind of have to get whatever you get from the other person. The superpower is that we could choose exactly the way that we enter into our online relationships and that we can get exactly what we want out of it. That we can know people or have knowledge of people without having to work for it, without having to talk to them, without having to be vulnerable ourselves. So there's both a promise, and which actually does work out sometimes, but there's a temptation here as well. So how are we doing with social media? How has it worked? Well, for one, we could look at those statistics about the deaths of despair that we saw earlier to know that the promise has not been fully lived out in our society and our culture. Clearly, social media has not solved the problems of loneliness, solved the problems of our social connectedness when there are so many people, more people than there used to be, who are dying these deaths of despair, who feel loneliness, who feel disconnected, who feel alienated more than they did just a few decades ago. So social media has not been able to solve this problem, we'll say. I was reading a newsletter the other day about someone who had taken an informal survey of about 40 new dads, new fathers, and what she heard back from them roughly translates to other statistics that I've heard. Half of the dads responded, said they didn't really have any friends that they could talk to honestly about their life, about their feelings. And I would say that's kind of what a friend is, right? If you've got friends that you can't talk honestly about what's going on in your life, I'm not sure that they're really friends. Not in the true and full sense of friendship. So about half the dads who responded to the survey said they didn't have that. They didn't have friends. Now, I'm sure a bunch of these dads had plenty of Facebook friends or other social media friends that they could say, oh, look, I have 600 friends on this platform or whatever. But half of them didn't have a single one that they felt that they could share honestly about their life. So something seems to often be missing in the way that we can use social media, or the way that we have been using social media. I've read statistics, I don't have it in front of me at the moment, where about half of men in this country say that they don't have a single close friend. So very similar to this statistic. Seems pretty concerning to me. And so there's something that is missing from social media. That doesn't mean social media is necessarily bad, but it's not living up to the promise that maybe we have given, an unreal expectation that we've had for it. And part of that reason might be because of what social media is, or maybe I should say what social media wants. One of the last things I want to talk about quickly is what social media wants, what it is after. And I'm going to use the example of Facebook because that's kind of what I'm most familiar with. If you know anything about young people, it's that younger people are not using Facebook as much. So it's kind of for my generation, and for older people are using Facebook. Teens and younger folks are using other things, but it doesn't matter. It's kind of the same idea. I want to contrast Facebook with a different kind of service that we may pay money for. For instance, our internet service. You likely have some kind of internet service that you pay directly to someone, like Spectrum or a Verizon Frontier, those kind of things. So you're paying money to use an internet service. You are the customer and you pay them as a provider. Facebook is not like that. Social media in general is not like that. I looked up the earnings from Facebook in 2021. Facebook made $29 billion. That's a lot of money. Of the $29 billion that they brought in, 28.5, so 98% of all the money that came into Facebook came from selling advertisements. So just to make the point that you are not really a customer of Facebook. You're actually the product that Facebook is selling to advertisers. Now, this doesn't make Facebook evil. In fact, this is a common business practice. You could argue that this was really the way that newspapers have survived the last 100 years, okay? So this is not necessarily bad. But we should think about what social media services want. What is their purpose? What is their intention? And you should know that Facebook does not provide this service to billions of people around the globe out of the goodness of its heart, or because it even wants you to be connected, regardless of what its mission statement says. Follow the money. Facebook does this to sell advertisements. So in any decision that Facebook makes about whether it's going to fall on this side of the decision that might be good for users like you and I, or a decision that will be good for advertisers like Coke or Pepsi or whoever, who do you think they're going to side with? Probably the side that's providing 98% of their business, right? Now, again, this doesn't mean you should stop using Facebook. This congregation uses Facebook. Many people do. So I'm not saying to stop. I'm not getting off Facebook in this particular moment. But we should understand what it is and why it may not live up to the promise that we hope in our hearts that social media will allow us to be infinitely connected to those around us, because it's just not really what it does. The question, though, is what do we do? How do we use it? So that's what I want to think about as we close today, is think about how we use social media to do this thing that humans do of going back and forth between being a person alone and being a person in community. That back and forth, how we are individually, but how we are in community. Our life is really going back and forth. We are created to go back and forth between how we are alone and how we are in community. So how do we use social media to do that, to honor that tension, to honor ourselves and our neighbors as persons, not just individuals? How can social media be like a bicycle for that process of being in a relationship? And how is it sometimes like a car that replaces what we were supposed to be doing, that kind of drives over, tramples over relationships, or leaves us lonely or without a single friend that we feel like we could share important details of our life with? So these questions, think about them. First of all, what questions or reactions do you have today? I'd love to hear, and you can comment on our website in the comments or on Facebook, since we're talking about Facebook. Put your comments there so we can continue this conversation. How can we use social media as a bicycle, like Steve Jobs' bicycle for our minds? How can we use it to enhance our human capability of being individuals, persons, alone, and in community? Could also maybe answer the question of, in what ways in your life are you treated as an individual? And then in what ways in your life are you treated as a person? In technology, what if technology treats you like an isolated individual? And in what ways does technology treat you or help you be a person who is fully connected to neighbors? Really connected. So let me know. I'd love to hear more and continue this. And as we move on to next week, same setup, we'll be looking at the next aspect of our Bible study, technology for humans. So I'll see you then.